the shared narrative that certain things are default good have gone out the window. So the default good that democracy is good, the default good that free speech and honest, earnest debate about challenging ideas is good, the idea that science and the scientific method is good. These are basic shared beliefs that hold a democracy together. All of these things have gone out the window, so we do not have a shared narrative in the Western world anymore. And that is terrifying to me. Terrifying to me.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris.
And I'm Yaniv.
And I'm Emil.
And on today's episode, we are going to discuss Google's bad news week with their fake AI demo and their loss of their antitrust case against Epic Games. We're also going to discuss the economy. The US stock market is coming back. Bitcoin is coming back. Does this mean the end of the downturn? What does it mean for your investments and your startup? And finally, we're going to discuss the university presidents being tagged with being anti-Semitic in front of Congress and the accusations that they lacked moral clarity in questions about anti-Semitism on campus, and how that impacts free speech, due process, and accusations of the woke mind virus. All right, let's jump right in. First up on the agenda is Google going through quite a bit of bad press this week. They first faked their AI demo, at least the most impressive demo for the new Gemini large language model, which was an incredible demo, but it turned out that part of that was a little bit, let's call it optimistic. And the other bad news they had was they lost a huge case with Epic Games, the developer of Fortnite, the judge calling their practices anti-competitive and ruling against them. So let's deal with the first one first. We've become the AI show lately. A lot of AI news is going on, which makes sense. Did you guys see that demo? Maybe we should describe it first, and then did you see the controversy around it?
I can give a bit more context on it, right? So just for those who haven't seen the demo, what it is it's like a video of a person and they start drawing a duck and then they like put some more context around it. And what's happening as the video plays is the AI is sort of providing commentary on it. It's like saying, oh, you're drawing a squiggly line. Oh, it looks like a duck. Oh, it's a blue duck. That's strange. Blue ducks don't exist in nature. And as the person does more, and then they play a game of rock, paper, scissors when the person is sort of holding out their hand and so on. And it just feels very natural and like it's interpreting the context.
Interpreting it in real time and with some humor, right? So he pulls out a blue rubber duck and it goes, what the quack? You have a blue duck. And we were just talking about a blue duck.
Right.
And
It can. We've reached AGI because it can tell dad jokes.
Yeah.
But more seriously, what happened? And Google would say it wasn't fake because it was all kind of disclosed in the disclaimer. But there were two things. One is that they did not feed the video to the AI and get that real-time commentary. What they did is they fed still images from the video to the AI offline and then like took the commentary and stitched it together.
and added a voice on top.
Yeah, I think also in some cases their prompting was a bit more elaborate than what was shown in the video. So with the rock, paper, scissors, in the video it says, it holds up two hands like this and says, can you guess what I'm doing? And it says, oh, you're playing rock, paper, scissors. But what the actual prompt was is like, can you guess what I'm doing? Hint, it's a game. Right? So they were giving a lot of help. And, you know, I think what Google has said and would say is that this was not supposed to be a live demo. It was supposed to be a kind of showcase of the capabilities of the language model. But, you know, I would say at best, it was misleading, highly misleading. At worst, it was like outright dishonest. But I guess the interesting question for me is, does it matter that much?
Well, I think it shows two things. It shows the pressure that Google is under to respond effectively to ChatGPT's threat, or ChatGPT plus Microsoft. And I think they're going fast and hard and playing a little loose to get there. And I think it shows the line that you need to play with in terms of truth in advertising, right? There is a lot of demos that are, let's call them edited or optimized.
Enhanced.
enhanced. I think one could argue there's some kind of fuzzy line, and Google found themselves on the other side of it. And I think intuitively for me, it does feel on the other side of that line. Because when I watched it, and I actually posted about it on LinkedIn in real time, and it actually brought a tear to my eye. I was speechless. I said to my wife, I turned to my wife and I said, I don't know if people understand how profound a breakthrough this is. For the second time in a year, because it's basically roughly on the anniversary of ChatGPT, my mind was blown. That there was a model that could observe video in real time, make observations unprompted, or at least prompted only by that video, and speak with this kind of fluency with an operator in a way that was intuitive and just multimodal. That was the point. That was the breakthrough that made me catch my breath and just go, I can't believe this is happening only 1 year after ChatGPT. It was that very thing, or much of that, which was fake. And so it really feels like it not just played with the line, I feel like it really blew past the line and misrepresented the breakthrough. That's, I think, a fair criticism and one that they should reckon with.
I mean, I agree with you. I have nothing more to add on that. I think the bigger company you are, the farther away from that line you have to be.
On the right side.
Yeah, because people expect more of you. And it did seem like in a rush to capture some PR momentum that they may have lost, that they went a little too far for no reason. Right. It was an amazing demo and it probably could work as well as that soon, maybe January. And I might have waited to that or did a lesser demo. I don't know what the upside for them in doing that, knowing it was going to be discovered. Like these things don't stay hidden. Yes, disclosures, all that stuff, but that's not the way anyone who watched it walked away feeling like, oh my God, I read the disclosures. Now I get it.
Well, let me actually take the other side of this. Not from a moral perspective, I think what they did was dishonest. But if you're just going to take an amoral view and say, did Google achieve what they intended to achieve with this? I actually think the answer might be yes, because I think the narrative before this video was it's OpenAI, Anthropic and whatever, and Google just being slow and they were caught flat-footed and all of that stuff. And they came out with this video, brought a tear to Chris's eyes and other people too. And people are like, oh, Google are a serious contender. And all the commentary I've seen is it's reminded people, it's like, oh, Google have been doing AI for longer than anyone else. And maybe they're a bit slow off the mark and maybe they're not good at bringing things to market, but their tech is super impressive. And, I've heard people say, really, this is like the Empire Strikes Back. It's OpenAI versus Google. Like these are the two big major players. And then this bit of news came out that maybe they'd gilded the lily quite a lot. It was a bit dishonest, but I don't think that's actually changed. I know for me, it hasn't changed that perception. It's like, oh, Google are a player. They're not really playing catch up anymore. They are for real. And watch out for Google. So yeah, I think maybe they got what they wanted to out of it.
This is all in the context of a foundation model that they announced called Gemini. Actually, really 3 models, right? There was kind of small, medium, large. The large one was intended to be the super model that could run in the cloud and do what it needed to do. Less efficient, more costly, but really powerful. Medium-sized model, which was, I think, also cloud-based, but a little cheaper to run, a little less comprehensive. And then a very small model that could run on the client, on the device. And it's called Gemini, and it was personally overseen, or at least contributed to, by Sergey
Brin, one of the co-founders of Google.
That's right. And, they moved pretty quick, right? And they shifted the whole company over to do a lot of this stuff. It's impressive. Putting aside demos, it is now potentially more powerful than ChatGPT or GPT in many ways, at least according to the benchmarks they released. And I think that is to be applauded and it's to be noticed and it's to be, as you say, Yaniv, there is now 2 serious large-scale players. And I think that's the message coming out of this. And for people building AI apps, tuning and refining AI models, you now need to think about 2 massive players with potentially a lot of momentum at their back. Nothing takes anything away from that in the long term, but I do think it was an unnecessary stumble with the demo. The other thing that's worth talking about here a little bit is the idea that people tend to talk about these companies as if they're people and as if they're monocultures. Google did this. Uber did that. Microsoft did this. I remember thinking at Uber whenever we got pegged for something, like, Uber is not a person. There isn't any one person called Mr. Uber. There's a lot of individuals trying their very best, a lot of subcultures in these squads and these groups, well-meaning, trying to hit their OKRs. And, it only takes a few people to make a stumble like this to create a demo that's a little bit optimistic or ambitious. And then all of a sudden, Google did it. And I just think as a sophisticated observer of the space, if you are an investor, if you're an operator, or you're a founder, and you are kind of piling on with this whole like Google did this and Microsoft did that, I think you're lacking some nuance that's important to know. And I think it's worthwhile for us to point that out.
Well, in this case, Sergey was involved, like the top, I think, the co-founder. So, and also, I don't know what the alternative is. Oh, the product management team at DeepMind did X.
The pro- the
We
product
do use these things as
the product
shorthand.
marketer at Google did for
Yeah.
DeepMind Gemini. Yeah.
But there's no alternative, guys. The buck has to stop somewhere, right? When we say the US government does this, there's like 2 million employees or how many politicians or cabinet secretaries. And yes, it's impossible for the top person to make every decision. But those decisions are attributed to the top person, at least insofar as they can go, okay, well, that was a mess up. We're not going to do that again. And here's what we're going to do about it. So, something, or else there's no accountability, right?
Yeah, and I think that helps you as an operator, as an investor, as a founder to think more clearly about the things going on around you. And I think as a principle of this show, you see a lot of, again, I'll call that Kara Swisher. You see a lot of these people who, whatever the company does, she goes, oh yeah, Zuck doesn't care about that anyway. I know Zuck. I hung out with him and he doesn't care about that. And it's just like, Kara, give it a break.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think journalists typically have a reductionist view of what companies are and attribute it to everything through a personality. Investors and startups, and for our audience, you're totally right. I mean, you're in a board meeting with your investor and you're like, why is CAC so high? You're like, I should go look at my product marketing department. Something's messed up there, and you try to focus on the smallest unit of the problem because you're a small company and you try to do that. You don't just say the company's effed up. So for our audience, you're right. We need to be like much more nuanced about where problems and opportunities are.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's the actionable takeaway here is you need to be thinking about these companies as small divisions, units, people. And when you're trying to think about partnering with them, competing with them, interacting with them, reverse engineering why they did something the way they did it, you need to understand that they're not monocultures. They're not homogenous. There are a lot of internal forces that move things left and right. So the next bit of bad news for Google was, of course, they lost the antitrust case against Epic Games. For a bit of context here, they're the developer of Fortnite, and they won a lawsuit against Google. With the jury ruling, Google's Play Store and Google's Play billing service formed an illegal monopoly, and the verdict concluded that Google held monopolistic power in Android distribution and in-app billing services, and it engaged in anti-competitive behavior. This is related all to commission payments for purchases through the store and getting access to users and devices through the OS. This is serious stuff, right? This is Apple and Google's core business when it comes to these phones and these operating systems. And of course, Apple's been going through its own disputes, let's say, about the App Store. And I think the EU is forcing it to allow third-party marketplaces to be loaded on and sideload applications. This changes the nature of the platform. It changes the nature of the ecosystem. It changes the nature of the safety and security posture of these devices. How do we feel about this?
I have mixed feelings about it because at the same time, I believe Google and Apple earned their monopolies through innovation and through good products. They just were the best and they proliferated. But on the other hand, you feel some of the power they wield is so massive. When they were talking about banning the Uber app, I mean, it would have been catastrophic for the company. And their ability to excise rents, therefore, is really powerful. But I don't know what the right answer is because, okay, they have to let third-party apps. So that means all the work they did, you're letting someone else just ride on that, right? And whatever security risk they bring to the table, you have to deal with it. So I feel like it's a problem, but I'm not sure what the answer is to it.
I'm in two minds about this as well, right? On one hand, I feel like they've earned the position they're in. And this is true of a lot of tech companies and a lot of debates about tech companies where they've created things that other companies would dream to create, whose stated goals are to create those things, right? Effective solutions to painful problems, solutions that are habit forming, that drive retention, solutions that have network effects that get better with more usage, effective rails that connect users to value and developers and ecosystems to users, which did not exist before, right? If you think about the past with Microsoft, with Windows, Windows was, and in many ways still is, a complete disaster of complexity, viruses. It's hard to get apps on and install them, understand how to cleanly remove them from your system. And the App Store model changed all that. It made it easy for your grandmother to grab an app, to use it, to uninstall it cleanly, and not deal with defragging her hard drive. This is really important innovation. The payment rails made it really easy to pay with secure authentication, hardware-based validation. This is incredible innovation that did not exist before. And so part of me believes, like, if you build a building, you're allowed to seek rent in that building. This rent-seeking term is it's just a ridiculous term. Yeah, you built it and you seek rent on it. That makes sense to me. But of course, on the other hand, as somebody who is not those people, as people in the startup ecosystem, trying to get access to those users, trying to maintain as much margin in your business model as possible, it kind of sucks when you build an app and you are being gatekept by these marketplaces. You have to pay them 30% and you can't get access to users any other way. There's definitely a downside to that. And I really think there's a tension there that is not obvious to me. And just saying, well, you should allow other marketplaces to run on the device. It's like maybe there needs to be a button that you can flip to go into advanced mode and the user accepts all of the complexity and the risk of doing that. And that's possibly the right answer there. And it's, kind of like not being paternalistic and allowing people to exit the safe mode. I think that's probably a safe compromise.
Chinese mobile phone users have had multiple App Store options for years. Early on, they forced Android to allow multiple app stores, so Baidu has an app store and whatever. And it has reduced the phone manufacturers to just bytes. All they are is hardware people. And everything else now comes with software. So it really destroyed sort of one industry in favor of another. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Apple, but that is how another system evolved. But there is more competition amongst the app stores on revenue share, and therefore consumers get more benefit from that at the end.
Yeah, where I do think Apple in particular, I don't know about Google as much, but where they go way past the line is they're kind of like, they don't want your app to become itself a platform. And they have very strict rules about that. I know we were trying to do something around turning the Uber app into a platform, and they're like, they had to bless it. And their stated policy was, you can't build a platform on top of our platform. And I was like, what? Are you serious? That does not introduce the kind of complexity that I think is reasonable to be concerned about, right? If a grandmother needs to install another marketplace to get access to another app, and by installing that marketplace, you're now exposed to a lower bar of security and protections, that is a reasonable concern, I think. But disallowing certain capabilities and platform-like features starts to, there's this really interesting line that they're flirting with.
I think there are clearer cases. I don't know details of this Epic Games, but let me give you an example. Spotify versus Apple Music. Apple has their own music app, and obviously they don't pay 30% revenue share to themselves. Spotify does. So they now inherently get a competitive advantage against Spotify because their cost structure is different. That, I think, is something that a lot of people could agree on is a problem.
Yeah.
They essentially are using economics to prefer their own separate service. It's sort of like Windows Office in a way, right? They're using one to drive the other. And that is a monopolistic concept also.
To me, that's the thing is, if Apple introduces Apple Pay, which is the easiest, slickest, most beautiful way to pay on an Apple device with built-in hardware verification and everything, and if I'm Epic Games or I'm Spotify and I want to power my payments with Apple Pay, then Apple Pay deserves to take a transaction fee for whatever it is they want to charge. If I want to use Stripe and credit card payments, I should be allowed to do that. And if those rails are not powered by Apple, then I get to keep that money. Audible doesn't let you buy books from the app. You have to go to the web because they don't want to pay the Apple tax. And I think that is definitely crossing the line. If your piece of software, your rails creates value, you should be able to take all the tax you want to charge. And if people want to use it and it creates enough value, then so be it. I think where the line gets fuzziest is in the app stores themselves. Are you allowed to load up other app stores and sideload apps and expose the entire platform to fragmentation? I think that's where it starts to get the fuzziest.
There are clear examples of abuse that I wish the government went after first. The Spotify example. There's another example is when you go into the Apple App Store and you type, I want the Uber app, and they sell the advertisement to Lyft up there. So a user has intent to find Uber app, and then they're making money trying to pitch you, which is totally optimizing for them. And they charge more for that. That feels abusive to me. And there's a few things I just wish they went after. And you could do a consent decree like they did with Microsoft to stop some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And Amazon has their own issues as opposed to, well, we have to fundamentally re-architect the entire industry, which may or may not work.
Yeah. And, the actions against Microsoft, I think there's a lot of debate you could have about whether that was positive or negative, but fundamentally, it added a lot of, let's call it headwind to that company for a long time, at a time that there was a lot of innovation to be done around the internet, around mobile and what have you. And that could have put a US company in great competitive advantage vis-a-vis China and other things. And it's kind of like stifling your children in a way. There's plenty of arguments to say that, that allowed Google to emerge and allowed Apple to do certain things, but it gives me a bit of pause when people build something and it's a little bit too successful. People like to cut them down. And of course, there's a difference between being too successful and being abusive, and that line is hard to find. I don't think it's black and white. All right, next topic. Well, let's talk about the economy. It's been a pretty shitty 12, 24 months. We were riding high on COVID at-home stocks and GameStop, diamond hands. I just watched the Dumb Money movie. And, there was big reversals of fortunes for dumb money versus Wall Street and pump and dumps, and then things were going crazy. Zero interest rate phenomena. And of course, post-COVID, post-stay-at-home stocks, post-interest rate hikes, all of that reversed pretty quickly. And VC dried up, Angel dried up, exits dried up, and everyone freaked out. But things seem to be turning around a little bit. The US stock market seems to be staging a comeback. Bitcoin and Ethereum and crypto is staging a little bit of a comeback. How do we feel about this? Is this a little blip and, we're still on a fast train to the bottom, or is this the beginning of a real recovery?
My view is we're in a good spot insofar as inflation is now sort of in the zone of the Fed targets, which means unlikely to have material interest rate hikes. And I didn't realize until the last 24 months or 18 months how important interest rates were to everything else in the economy. And the way investors hold their money in money market accounts that are paying 5.5% with no risk versus become LPs and venture funds. I mean, there's a real impact that in home mortgage prices and how the housing market's totally stopped and stuck because of this. So if the inflation story is under control and the Fed starts to cut rates like next year and unemployment's low, I feel like that's a soft landing, so to speak, and probably good news. Now, I think fundamentally the landscape for startup fundraising has changed for the long term. Right. The amount of liquidity that was out will be decade before it ever comes back to that size again. And there's going to be a lot more scrutiny, a lot more due diligence on startups, period. And that's going to last for a long time. But at least it'll get a little looser for our audience. It's not going to go back to 21, but it's looser.
Tell me a bit about that. Why do you think it's going to take a decade? I'll tell you why I'm digging into that. Because in my experience, these ebbs and flows, these peaks and troughs, tend to happen more violently than anybody predicts. And they seem to be happening more violently and more often because of social media and FOMO and all this kind of stuff. And, the AI thing is a whole other gold rush now. And it feels like within 12, 24 months, we'll be back to like the heydays. I'm not saying that will happen. I'm saying it feels very reasonable that could happen. So why is your sense that, this is going to take a decade for us to get back to the peaks of excessive investing in startups?
I think that the $46 billion valuation that Instacart got, that's now 6 or 7, the falls have been so dramatic in the late stage in particular. The Tiger or SoftBank, and they were leading the charge, and WeWork, all these enormous valuations were so far above expectations. You could say that, yes, their OpenAI is in the same place and so on, but I think there's just going to be a lot less LP appetite for that kind of thing again. Like the LPs who are like, holy cow, we just lost X 100 million on FTX, X 100 million. And those are real numbers. I think they're just going to have a lot more reticent to put those kind of numbers to work.
Yeah, I think there's, that's all roughly right, of course. I just think that these wild swings seem to be happening more frequently and more aggressively than they used to happen before. And we have more black swan events and more and higher peaks and lower troughs. And when you add the tailwind of AI and you add the tailwind of the Robin Hood generation who learned how to invest, and you add the signal that I'm seeing in the public markets where any good news is an excuse to go risk on. It just feels like people are champing at the bit to go like, now? Can we go now? Can we go now? And it's just like any signal that the economy is softening and therefore the interest rates might drop. People are just like, all of a sudden the stocks are just going up. And it's no longer institutional money who have long memories and big institutional funds to think about. These people have had a taste of GameStop and they had a taste of Bitcoin, and they had a taste of what have you, and they're like, well, as soon as we get any signal that it's the right time, we're going to pile back in. And that changes that downstream equation pretty quickly. Now, I'm not arguing this is going to take less than a decade. I'm not arguing that this will be the way it plays out. I'm just saying it feels a little bit more like there's a lot of dry powder and pent up energy to go back on the risk on and to go back to that place. And AI and those kind of dynamics are helping a lot.
I think the exit value thing is really important. If anyone investing in a late stage round now is not looking at the public comps, well, they're making a mistake. And the public comps are suggesting that era was just, there was something else going on there that wasn't consistent with general market principles. But you're right, LPs and everyone wants to be back into venture. They just needed to settle into a rational valuation calculation, but then the money will be back. So there's two separate things, like liquidity for small companies, that is coming back and that'll come back quickly. Liquidity at the nosebleed valuations we had before that's going to take a while to get back.
I think the other dynamic also that struck me was that the quarter-over-quarter comparables, they seem to be telling almost a false narrative, right? Because we had these COVID highs that were artificially inflated, and then we had these COVID drops that were artificially negative. And I think as we start to normalize, I think the comparables will start to look much better, and the fundamentals, shift again. And it's like, oh wow, all of a sudden Nvidia is doing crazy numbers, and all of a sudden Tesla's doing crazy numbers, and it's like it's not crazy. It's just that there was a huge ripple in the system and we're digesting the ripple, right? And I saw a headline the other day. I didn't read the article, but it's like it was Americans are doom spending. They're just like, we don't care. We're just going to spend the money. And consumer sentiment seems to have not gone very far. It's, it just also chomping at the bit like, can we spend now? Can we just buy things? And Christmas is coming up. And it's just, yeah, it's really interesting time. Really interesting time.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal.
All right. Next and final subject we want to discuss is the presidents of UPenn, Harvard, and MIT presenting in Congress about anti-Semitism on campus at their colleges and other colleges. They were asked some interesting questions, and one in particular was around what rises to anti-Semitism and actionable rhetoric from students, in particular is calling for the genocide of Jews, classified as harassment. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, all of them went to great pains to try to answer in a fairly, let's call it, academic and nuanced way about, well, there is rhetoric and then there is action, and if it rises to action, then it becomes actionable, and that becomes against policy. And the lawmakers and the general public decided that was not, let's call it, their favorite term is moral clarity. That was not morally clear enough for them, and they wanted them to just say all anti-Semitism is bad and everyone should get expelled.
I think you're putting words in people's mouths there, Chris.
Okay, I'm editorializing as we go. I think my opinion here is fairly clear. And so the president of UPenn, Liz McGill, has been fired for her equivocation. Harvard's president, Claudine Gay, actually has been retained. The governing body at Harvard said, no, we're standing behind her. And I'm not really sure what happened to the MIT president. I think that's still pending. What do you guys think about what happened? Any extra color you want to add? And how do you think this is playing out? And why is it playing out this way?
I think that what is happening is that some traditional political affiliations are sort of breaking down a little bit. And, this is sort of like a really interesting test on free speech and where's the line of free speech, and then where does creating a safe space for students fit in, and so on. And, I think what's happened here is that these university presidents have been sort of hung by their own petard a little bit, in the sense that what has happened, and I've got nuanced thoughts on this, I guess, but I think it is true that over the last decade or two, there have been more and more constraints on what it is okay to say, or at least there are things that are not okay to say because they are seen as creating a less safe environment for students and so on. And so there have actually been a lot of restrictions on speech. And so there's been this environment created. And then in Congress, these university presidents were asked, is it okay to call for the genocide of Jews? And they were like, well, it depends, right? And it's like, you know what? If you were always a free speech absolutist, or even, if the universities were bastions of free speech and they've been taking the heat for the last while and said, you know what, like, we fight for people's right to say things, even things that make other people uncomfortable, then I'd be like, you know what, like, more power to them. But we have a situation, and I think that's what has inflamed people, where you can walk away from that with a sense of like, it's okay to call for the genocide of Jews, but it's not okay to use certain words that might be seen as cultural appropriation. And I think the gap between like what is okay to say and what is not okay to say was just so stark. And it was like, it felt indefensible and morally bankrupt. That's my view. And that's why the reaction happened the way it did.
I actually think that's a really good take because, let's start with the obvious, because if you don't start with the obvious, then people freak out and they don't give you the benefit of the doubt, okay? Genocide, calling for the genocide of any group is bad. Dumb and ridiculous.
Don't do that. Don't do that, kids.
Let's start with that. Let's just so that the trolls don't come out and accuse us of not condemning the things that must be condemned. The other thing that's worth saying here is there's the popular podcast that might follow some format like this, like All In, right? I think they're quick to talk about the woke mind virus on college campuses and declare college campuses bankrupt and need to be eliminated or reset or restarted or what have you. And I think that's an all too black and white. perspective. Where I definitely agree with you, Yaniv, is on the double standard. I do think there has been this collapsing space for free speech around not just cultural appropriation, but about debates about gender and debates about power and debates about all sorts of things. And there have been speakers at universities and debates on universities and protests on universities that have disinvited people and just they want to stick their fingers in their ears and go, la, 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 we don't want to hear that alternative point of view. And I think the university admins have been kind of happy for that to be happening. And I think you're right. They've gone back to thoughtful, nuanced discussion about the subject. And I think their previous behavior has undermined their current nuance. But I actually think rather than remove their current nuance, they need to apply their nuance to everything else, which is to say that people should be able to argue the most disgusting things, the most disagreeable things, the most controversial things, and have their arguments challenged and debated in public, in institutions of learning. And I think that shutting down debate, even the most disgusting debate or ideas like genocide of Jews or genocide of anybody, is ultimately, in the medium to long term, bad for society. And I'll very quickly finish up with, I also have a problem with the skipping over of due process powered by mob justice. I don't like the idea that the Twitter mob can call for the firing of a university administrator and that the people in power just acquiesce. I think there needs to be a lot more bravery and courage in the world where appropriate and where necessary. And I don't see that happening in enough places.
I mean, before October 7th, words were violence in a lot of cases on university campuses when it came to transgender issues or just so many issues. Words were violence, and people would literally say that. Now, these words, which actually talked about violence, weren't violence. And that inconsistency, as you point out, Yaniv, was absurd. Like totally absurd that the presidents of these great universities could literally change what they've been doing for a long time. And on this one issue, when it relates to this ethnic group, this religious group, the same words or violence doesn't apply. It was just mind blowing to me. So I thought they did a terrible job and they deserved sort of the ridicule that they got. On the second point, though, I'm not going to use the words woke mind virus. I went to Harvard and Stanford myself a long time ago, and these universities have changed. I think the congressperson put a stat of what is the percentage of professors that consider themselves conservative. If you want to talk about diversity of ideas, 1%. So that means you have 99% of one political persuasion or the other. That moves the Overton window. You could sort of take comfort in the fact that everyone thinks like you do at a university, and your professors and the administration, the admissions committee. So I think you have a real problem at these universities with they're way far away from any notion of balance of viewpoints. And by the way, the country is 52-48. If a university is 99-1, there's a problem there if you're trying to educate leaders. And I think these universities should be trying to educate leaders, not activists. Some leaders can be activists, but leaders. And to be a leader in this country, you have a diverse population in many dimensions, and they should be fired, but that's not going to solve the problem. These whole infrastructures of professors and the majors and grade inflation, all these have made these places monocultures. And that's really bad for the best universities of our country.
Yeah. Look, I actually, maybe disappointingly for the audience, I think I agree with you. But why do I react negatively to a term like woke mind virus is because I think it risks throwing a baby out with the bathwater, right? I think what has happened is that social justice is a real issue. There have been highly privileged groups and highly underprivileged groups in the US and in countries all over the world for a long time. And I think the social justice movement was there initially to restore some of that balance and to say, you do not just get to perpetuate your privilege. You do not get to talk down to everybody. And I'm actually strongly supportive of that. But where I've become uncomfortable, especially the last few years, is to your point, Emil, where it has become an orthodoxy, where it's become a creed, where it's become a monoculture, which is like, okay, it's one thing to protect people and to make sure that people who have traditionally suffered a lot do not suffer unnecessarily. And it's another thing to say there are things that simply cannot be questioned or discussed. They must be treated as facts, even though they are not facts in the scientific objective sense, right? These are social justice or political positions that you have to treat as facts. Then if you transgress, if you feel something different, or even if you ask questions or if you question these ideas, then that is not okay. I think that's problematic. I think there is guilt on all sides as often as, one thing about speech is the things you choose to speak about are a choice as well, right? You can speak about anything in the world. So the things you choose to emphasize, that is a decision. And so when I look at, for example, trans issues, right? My issue with all the discussion of trans issues is that the choice to aggressively question them is a political choice. Right. So I'm not comfortable with that. But at the same time, I'm not comfortable with the idea of none of these things are topics that can even be discussed. And I do think that universities, especially, are supposed to be a place where ideas are discussed, where there is a seeking of truth. And you cannot have that if there, huge swathes of discourse are simply off limits and you have to toe the line. So when I say, I don't like woke mind virus as a term, is I think there is a pendulum that has swung too far and it needs to move back a little bit. But, it's also not the case that you want to go to the good old days where, if you weren't a white Protestant male, then everything was a whole lot harder and that your rights were not equal. So that's the balance, I think, that we need to hit. And, like with most politics, right, it's perhaps unsatisfying that the truth is to be found closer to the center than it is to the extremes.
Yeah, I agree. And, just to be very clear, I think that the pendulum has swung and it's swung too far. But I think it's reasonable to say, like, a little overcorrection, a little collateral damage is okay. It's been one way for so long and so damaging for so long that in the rebalancing, you're going to break some eggs. It is essential for all well-meaning people to observe the breakage of the eggs and say, hey, that's not right either, and we should probably put that pendulum back in the middle. Dealing with one injustice by creating more injustice or a different kind of injustice is itself an injustice. You could apply that to some of the wars going on right now. And so, I do think it is now time for reasonable people to say it is appropriate that we corrected some injustices and that we continue to correct them. But we can't have absolutist orthodoxy that eliminates conversation because in a democracy, part of the world that we believe to be free, freedom is rooted in conversation and in debate and in informed people. But at the moment, as we've all been saying, there are topics that just can't be discussed or orthodoxy that can't be challenged. There is orthodoxy that can't be challenged by you, right? Like you, Mr. White male, or you, Mr. person of that ethnic group, you should just sit down and shut up. You're not allowed to have a perspective. And then there is discussions that you can't have with certain words. And if you accidentally stumble into one of these words, which are, by the way, dynamically changing, then you immediately get shouted down as well. And so there's this kind of effort to eliminate debate just based on the words you choose or the nature of who you are or on what is felt to be settled law or settled orthodoxy. And it's not about any one subject, anti-Semitism or trans rights or what have you. It's about the ability to have real, honest, important conversations in a democracy and to disagree with each other and to air those disagreements and to find some new durable consensus and truth. And if we can't have that, we have nothing.
I would add, though, there is a math problem here. We have a top of funnel problem, at least at these universities, where if 99% of the professors are of one political persuasion and 90% of the students are, you can't have enough of those conversations, Chris. Right. So I'm not saying it has to be 52-48, but I'm saying there has to be some reflection as to what society is so you can challenge your ideas. I will say Van Jones said it great. He said, you go to college, you have a right to physical safety, but you actually do not have a right to intellectual safety.
Right. I don't think anybody has a right to intellectual safety. I think that's a
Yeah.
bullshit idea. You can't discuss important subjects without having your intellect challenged. And I just that's such a dumb idea. Sorry.
I mean, yeah, but there's a third type of safety, right? Like, again, let's talk about calling for violence against ethnic groups, right? That doesn't necessarily endanger your physical safety, but it's still not good for there is a mental safety. And this is where it gets problematic because it can become a slippery slope. And I think it has become one where it's like use of racially charged epithets against people at university campuses is not okay, even though it's not physical violence.
Yeah. I'm not suggesting that. I mean, having studied this a little bit, words can be incitement to violence, right? So I'm not saying it actually has to be violence. And you can say racial epithets to a person and they're called fighting words. And those are not constitutionally protected. And if you had a group of people surrounding the Hillel at Harvard saying these things and there was 300 people, you might be like genuinely reasonable person come out there being afraid for their life. And that's not okay.
Those things are illegal, right? And calls to violence and, mobs surrounding people. That is real violence and real danger. I think there's no debate about that.
There's an interesting thing, Emil, like you're talking about the fact that there are so few conservative academics on campus and that they feel their ideas are not welcome. If you're a member of a group and you do not feel welcome on campus, that is a problem. So there's an irony here, right? Like if you go to a campus and you feel, let's say you're black, and you feel like this is not a place that is welcoming to black people, even if there is no physical violence, I think that is problematic. If you're a trans and this is a place that is not welcoming for trans people, that is problematic. And yes, if you have certain political views that are within the general mainstream discourse and those are not welcome, then that is problematic too.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, but it's so important to define terms, though, right? Because
Always.
what does welcome mean? Well, I'm obviously not talking about African Americans not feeling welcome on campus, but I'm talking about ideas now. If you have an idea that is not welcome, that does not mean you are not welcome, or it does not mean the debate is not welcome, and it doesn't mean you deserve to have your ideas accepted whole cloth, and it doesn't mean your ideas should be rejected whole cloth. The debate itself should be welcomed. The debater should be welcomed, even while their ideas are challenged, and challenged respectfully. There's a long tradition of debate, of what good debate looks like. And so I think there's a difference between feeling like your debate and your earnest ideas are welcomed, even while the specific thing you're saying is challenged. And you may even feel threatened intellectually by that challenge. But I don't think we should conflate this with like making an ethnic group uncomfortable on campus. The ideas can make you uncomfortable, but your presence and harassment of your presence should not be part of this conversation. That is a line too far.
When I think about this most broadly, for me, it comes back to, are we a melting pot as a country, or are we a multicultural society where we don't have a commonality that binds us? And being an immigrant, I like to think we're a melting pot and that we're forging some commonality, some common truths, some common beliefs. And those beliefs are good, and maybe they weren't perfect in the Constitution and we should improve them and so on. But starting from a good faith, and this was kind of Obama rhetoric, right? The shared value system, and then making sure that the people who have differences than the main also feel comfortable to be different, right? But not calling for the murder of each other all along the way, right? Yeah. But maybe that's too highfalutin here, but that's
it is the fundamental problem, because the shared narrative that certain things are default good have gone out the window. So the default good that democracy is good, the default good that free speech and honest, earnest debate about challenging ideas is good. The idea that science and the scientific method is good. The idea that the media is a fundamental good and not the enemy of the people. The idea that your opposition, those with opposing ideas, are not fundamentally anti-American or anti-civilization. These are basic shared beliefs that hold a democracy together. All of these things have gone out the window, so we do not have a shared narrative in the Western world anymore. And that is terrifying to me. The idea that, there is a presidential candidate it's not about their policies, it's about the cult of their personality and about questioning these fundamental ideas. And yet it's still like 50-50 coin toss, like maybe he'll win, maybe he won't, who knows, we'll see. It's just going to be a swing a little bit this way or that way. That is just, it just boggles the mind. It's very, very scary. All right, another fun episode as always, guys. I guess we haven't solved any of the world's problems today, but we'll keep chipping away at it.
Shocker.
Emil, thanks for joining us as always.
Great to be here. It was a fun conversation.
Absolutely. Good stuff.
All right, we'll catch you all in the next one. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.